It's great to be here. I was flattered to get the invitation, and thank all you people for coming tonight and all you wonderful people who do wonderful things for animals. I'm probably preaching to the converted tonight. If I'm not, well, then it's about time that you converted. And if I am, then I think I can give you information for talking to your friends and others who can make changes. We can all do more. Everyone in this room who does so much already can all do more. So I'll give you a little food for thought. And I think the best way to make some of the points I want to make tonight would be to just do some bullet points about some of the work that I do and talk about our complex relationships with animals. So I'll just jump into that. Some things that always strike me is how we have human beings, but we don't have dog beings. And I can never understand why the word beings is reserved for only humans. So that would be one change that we could make right away. My biology friends look at me like I've flown halfway across the world and drank a vodka drink when I say that, which I have done tonight. So I think we need vocabulary changes. We should be referring to animals as who, not it or that. You know, it's interesting that word processing programs will always correct you if you refer to the animal who did something. It'll ask you to put that or which. Another point that I used to get criticized for, but it doesn't happen that much anymore, is that of being anthropomorphic. So the example I always give to people, and it's a very simple one, I think it's a waste of time to worry about being anthropomorphic anymore. If I say, oh, look at that elephant in a zoo, you know, she's really unhappy, or look at that cow or kangaroo on a factory farm, oh, you know, she's really sad, though people will say, oh, you're just being really anthropomorphic, she's happy, and then it gets really quiet. And the question is why is it anthropomorphic to say that an animal is suffering, but it's not anthropomorphic to say that the animal is happy? Okay, and it's just something that I think we really need to process, that the critics of anthropomorphism use it all the time. So I think that would be one major change that we could do, is just not engaging in arguments about that we're being anthropomorphic. Of course we are. We're anthropoid apes, and we only have a certain language with which to refer to other animal beings. Another main problem is that animals are non-consenting property across the world. We can really do anything we want to animals. They're property. In America, you know, you could treat animals like your couch or like your backpack, and really nothing gets done. Enforcement is really, really weak. So that's another thing that we really need to change. We move animals around. We redecorate nature, I like to say it. We say, oh, wouldn't a couch look good in the living room? Oh, wouldn't a wolf look good in Yellowstone Park, for example? Because we do these things because we can do them. We're basically big-brained, invasive, and arrogant mammals. That's who we are. And with all this talk about footprints, we're also big-footed. We step anywhere we want, and we can do anything we want. And I think that we need organizations like Voiceless and other organizations to make these changes. Now, as a biologist, one of the principles that I adhere to is the notion that's called evolutionary continuity. It sounds like a big phrase. Charles Darwin put it forth. And what Charles Darwin was saying was that the differences among animal species are differences in degree rather than differences in kind. The differences are shades of gray, not black and white. So to me, the bumper sticker would be, if we have something, so too do they being other animals. So if we have emotional lives, they have emotional lives. There's been a lot of resistance applying the notion of continuity to behavior, to emotional lives, to the moral lives of animals. But we do it all the time. It's implicit in biomedical research, okay? I mean, we do horrible things to animals in the name of science because they're so much like us. But if they're so much like us, there's a problem, because that means they must suffer like we do, or they suffer in their own ways. So it's a double-edged sword, and I think people should be called to the table for it, that we justify using animals who are similar to us for our ends, not their ends. Another point that I travel a lot and I see all around the world in different cultures is how confused and how paradoxical and how frustrating and how challenging our relationships with other animals are. So when people tell me they love animals and then they harm them, I always say I'm glad that they don't love me. Because they do. I mean, I know people who say, well, I love animals, like in America, I love deer, and therefore I go out and I hunt them. Or I really like cows and chickens, and then I eat them no matter how badly they've been treated. So I think we are so confused about our relationship with animals, we really should be taking people and moving them out of their comfort zones. When they say things like that, we should say, well, could you explain to me how you love a being and then you knowingly harm that being or allow that being to be harmed? That's another thing. A lot of times people are very passive about what happens to other animals. Another major problem is what's called speciesism. Some of you may know about that. But it's looking at animals, including humans, as members of a species and ignoring individual differences. And so what happens, of course, is because humans do the categorizations, guess who winds up on top? We do, by the way. That was not a test. So what happens is higher becomes synonymous with better or smarter or more valuable. So speciesistic thinking is really bad biology, but it has a lot of effects on the way people treat animals. So, for example, in the United States, there's an animal called the black-footed ferret. It's an endangered rodent, and the people running this program raise golden hamsters solely to be fed to the ferrets. So I've protested this and generated some strong movement against this practice, and I'll say, well, if you're trading off hamsters for ferrets, it must mean that you value ferrets more than you value hamsters. And they'll go, oh, no, we don't. And I'm saying, well, but you must. You know, I mean, you're raising an animal, you're bringing an animal into the world solely to be practice prey for a predatory rodent. I don't think that's good. In Southern California, in fact, this weekend, there's an event called Trading Claws for Paws. And what this Humane Society is doing is they're going to have a lobster fest in order to raise money to save dogs. Yeah, I know. It's bizarre. We know lobsters feel pain. It's just not a good practice. But once again, when I talk to some of the people doing this, and they're well-intentioned people, I mean, I really don't want to drag them through the mud too much, you know, I'll say, well, you're trading off lobsters for dogs. Why are you doing that? Why don't you just, you know, give somebody a year membership at some golf club in Southern California? Another trade-off would be when we see birds do something better than chimpanzees, for example. It's known that New Caledonian crows, some of you may know this, can make and use more complex tools than chimpanzees. But when birds do something better than chimpanzees, no one says the birds are smarter than chimpanzees. But the minute a chimpanzee does something better than a bird or a mouse, people jump on and say, see, chimpanzees are smarter. This is all speciesistic thinking, and it's very dangerous in terms of how we interact with animals. Now, another point that I know a lot of activists get sort of thrown at is they say, well, caring for animals means caring less for people, but that's just not so. In fact, people who care for animals tend to care for people. People who care about people tend not to have these strong feelings for animals. So I think it's just very dangerous. Another thing that I've been working on, I published a book last year called Wild Justice, which is about the moral lives of animals, is that people look at animals as being competitive, nature red in tooth and claw type of things. And I always say that it's not a dog-eat-dog world because dogs don't eat other dogs. But I really mean that. I mean, they don't. And so what we're learning now, and I think it's information that we can all use when we talk to people to try to convert them or to, solidify your own feelings, is that across species, what we call prosocial or positive or cooperative behaviors are predominant. People have looked at summaries of the behavioral repertoire and the sorts of social interactions in which animals engage. And across primates, for example, more than 95% of their interactions are friendly, prosocial, and positive. So when someone says to me, "Oh, you're acting like an animal," I always say, "Well, thank you," because that's a compliment. I teach a course in a prison, and when the prisoners say, "Oh, you're just acting like an animal," I always say, "Well, you just complimented them." I realize that has dire consequences sometimes, but the fact is they are. So some examples I can give you. We know that mice are empathic. There was a very detailed, horrific study done a few years ago at McGill University that showed that mice feel the pain of other mice. But in the United States, even after 5 years of knowing that, it's not factored into the Animal Welfare Act. When I was in Africa, I met a whole lot of elephants up close and personal. And I met a female elephant named Babel, and Babel had a mangled right rear leg and couldn't walk very well. And the elephants in her group would wait for her and would feed her. And biologists would say, well, surely they're doing that because Babel does something for them, because biologists don't like to think that other animals are nice, especially biologists who torture other animals, or people who keep elephants in zoos or prisons. And the fact of the matter is that Babel couldn't do anything. If Babel were left alone, she would have been attacked by a predator. Just trying to think of some other examples. Oh, yes. Lots of animals mourn the loss of kin and friends. I watched a really neat magpie funeral ritual a few years ago. How long do I have? 5 minutes. Oh, plenty of time. I was riding my bicycle into Boulder, Colorado, and I came around a corner, and there was a corpse of a magpie in the street, and there were 4 or 5 magpies around, essentially their friend or family. And one went in and pecked at the corpse. Another went in and pecked at the corpse. One flew off, brought back some pine needles and some grasses and laid it by the corpse. Another did it, another did it. They all stood around the corpse and almost imperceptibly bowed their heads and then flew off. And I was with a friend of mine who doesn't know anything about animal behavior, and he was just like, "Oh my goodness, did you see that? You probably see that all the time." And I went, "No, in fact, I've never seen it." And I published that, and, to date, 4 or 5 years later, I've had, 75 or 80 emails from people who have seen such funeral rituals in corvids, the magpies, crows, and ravens. And just recently, I got a nice little note from a woman who saw the same thing in sparrows. So, where can we go with what we know? The important thing is that we know a lot about other animals. We know a lot about their emotional lives, their levels of sentience, their conscious, their self-conscious, and some animals also have very highly developed moral lives, moral sentiments. So what can we do with what we know? Well, I wrote a book last year called The Animal Manifesto, 6 Reasons for Expanding Our Compassion Footprint. So the Animal Manifesto, as I see it, is simply treat us better or leave us alone. All animals can do well without us except our companion animals. Okay, we really muck things up when we interfere in the lives of animals, when we redecorate their homes, and when we go off and we harm them for our ends, not their ends. What kind of future would I like? Well, I would like to see everybody be vegan. I would like to see biomedical research stop and invasive research on animals stop. I think these may be endpoints in the future, but I'm also a realist. So what I see we can do is we can set examples for other people in terms of how we should interact with other animal beings. We need to be proactive. We need to be compassionate. We need to be nice to the other side, if you will. That's hard to do sometimes, but we really do. We need to embrace them and listen to them. And I always tell my students who want to, say, combine biology and activism is sometimes you just have to pick your own battles and write people off. Sometimes you're not going to convince somebody or you won't be able to change them. And the activism tactic from the other side is, let's get you to waste your time. We all have limited time and limited energy, so we have to pick our battles well. And so I think what I would like to see, and why I love to travel and talk to people, is I'm a real dreamer and I'm an optimist, and I actually believe that human beings and animal beings are born to be good, that we really have inherent and innate goodness to us. We've been co-opted by bad readings of biology, about nature red in tooth and claw and the competitive aspects. And so I really like to think that we all have a lot of good to put into the world, and that we all need to agree to work together to add compassion to the world. And I'm developing this idea of what I call a compassion footprint, where we can expand our compassion footprint as we reduce our carbon footprint. So I'll just end off tonight asking everyone here who does so much for animals anyway to see if you can do more and to make this the century of compassion. So thank you.